For decades, James Garner occupied a rare place in Hollywood. He wasn't the loudest star, the most scandalous, or the most aggressively marketed. Instead, he was something far more unusual: trusted. Audiences believed him. He felt real in a town built on illusion. Whether he was the smooth-talking Maverick or the weary private investigator Jim Rockford, Garner carried an ease that made viewers feel like they were watching a man, not a performance. That image stayed intact for more than 30 years, but behind it lived a life shaped by violence, pain, and a constant fight against systems designed to control him. Before we continue, take 1 second to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you don't miss more real stories like this. James Scott Bumgarner was born in Norman, Oklahoma during the harshest years of the Great Depression. His childhood did not resemble the calm confidence he would later project on screen. His mother died when he was only 5 years old, a loss that fractured the emotional center of his life. His father, overwhelmed and struggling, remarried a woman who would leave permanent scars on James and his siblings. She was abusive, physically and emotionally, and the household became a place of fear rather than safety. Years later, Garner would speak about being beaten with shocking matter-of-factness, not for sympathy, but because pain had become normalized early in his life. That early exposure to violence shaped him in ways he didn't fully understand until much later. Garner learned to endure. He learned to stay quiet. He learned that authority figures could not always be trusted, and that survival often meant compliance on the surface while resistance simmered underneath. These lessons would follow him directly into Hollywood. Before fame ever found him, Garner left home early. He bounced between jobs, searching for structure and belonging. That search eventually led him to the military. During the Korean War, he served as a rifleman and was wounded twice. The injuries he sustained would never fully heal. One came from shrapnel, another from frostbite so severe it permanently damaged his feet. At the time, he brushed it off. Soldiers were expected to. But those wounds became the foundation of decades of chronic pain that would later define his daily life more than his success ever did. When Garner returned home, acting was not a dream, it was an accident. A friend convinced him to try a class, and his natural presence was immediately obvious. Casting directors noticed him not because he was flashy, but because he felt grounded. In the rigid, polished studio system of the 1950s, that grounded quality stood out. Warner Brothers signed him to a contract, and like many young actors of the era, Garner believed he had been given a golden opportunity. What he didn't realize was that the contract gave the studio near total control over his time, his image, and his future. The studio system was efficient, profitable, and deeply unforgiving. Actors were assigned roles, schedules were brutal, and personal boundaries were irrelevant. Garner was worked constantly. He was loaned out to other studios without consent, placed into projects he didn't believe in, and expected to perform regardless of physical condition. Complaints were treated as ingratitude. Resistance was punished quietly but effectively. His breakout role came with the television series Maverick. The character suited him perfectly: relaxed, witty, slightly rebellious. Audiences loved it, and the show became a massive success. But behind the scenes, the workload was relentless. Filming schedules were punishing, scripts were rushed, and the physical toll began to show. Garner's war injuries flared under the pressure, but medical support was minimal. Painkillers became routine, exhaustion became permanent. More importantly, Garner began to see the machinery clearly. The same system that celebrated him publicly dismissed his autonomy privately. When he raised concerns about working conditions and compensation, he was labeled difficult. When he pushed back against being overworked, he was sidelined. Eventually, he did something almost unheard of at the time. He sued Warner Brothers for breach of contract. The lawsuit was not just risky, it was dangerous to his career. Studios controlled casting, distribution, and reputation. Suing one of them could quietly end everything. Garner knew this. He did it anyway. The lawsuit dragged on, and while he eventually won, the victory came at a cost. He was effectively blacklisted for a period. Roles dried up, invitations stopped coming. The industry didn't need to punish him loudly. Silence was enough. This period marked the beginning of his so-called double life. On the surface, James Garner remained the charming leading man. In reality, he was navigating financial uncertainty, chronic pain, and a deepening distrust of the industry that fed off his image. Depression began to creep in, though at the time it wasn't discussed openly, especially not by men, especially not by movie stars. When Garner eventually returned to prominence with the Rockford Files, it seemed like a comeback story. The show was a hit, and the character of Jim Rockford, cynical, tired, quietly principled, felt even closer to Garner's true self. But once again, success came with a price. The show's demanding stunt work exacerbated his injuries. He performed many of his own stunts not out of bravado, but because the production often didn't allow time for safer alternatives. His knees, back, and feet deteriorated rapidly. By the late 1970s, Garner had undergone multiple surgeries. He was in constant pain, often unable to sleep. On set, he remained professional, even lighthearted, but off-camera the strain was immense. He began to withdraw socially. Interviews became more guarded. He wasn't hiding scandals, he was protecting what little energy he had left. What makes Garner's story unique is not a dramatic collapse or a public breakdown, it is the absence of spectacle. While other stars burned out loudly, Garner endured quietly. He fulfilled contracts, he showed up, he smiled, and then, when the cost became too high, he stepped back. This withdrawal confused the public. Where had James Garner gone? Why wasn't he everywhere anymore? The assumption was that his time had passed. The truth was more complicated. He had made a decision, not to chase relevance, but to preserve dignity. He chose fewer roles, more control, and longer periods of absence. To Hollywood, this looked like disengagement. To Garner, it was survival. By the time he reached later life, the double life had stretched across decades. The man America trusted had spent 30 years navigating pain, resisting control, and paying privately for public success. And yet, he never positioned himself as a victim. He never wrote a bitter tell-all. He never exposed names. Silence for him was not avoidance, it was autonomy. James Garner didn't vanish, he recalibrated, and in doing so, he quietly challenged the idea that fame must come at the cost of selfhood.
In James Garner's later years, the physical toll of his earlier life became impossible to ignore. The injuries he carried since the Korean War, compounded by decades of demanding television work and repeated surgeries, slowly narrowed his world. Walking became difficult. Chronic pain never fully receded. Yet even as his body weakened, his clarity remained sharp. Garner never chased sympathy, and he never reframed his life as tragedy. He spoke plainly, without drama, about what endurance had cost him. Unlike many Hollywood figures, Garner did not attempt a grand comeback. He appeared occasionally. Carefully chosen roles, often quieter, more reflective characters that mirrored where he was in life. Films like Space Cowboys allowed him to work alongside longtime peers, not as a relic, but as an equal. There was no desperation in these appearances. They felt like punctuation marks, not restarts. As the years passed, his presence in public life faded further. This absence created myths. Some believed he had been pushed out. Others assumed his career had simply ended. The reality was simpler and more deliberate. Garner had learned early that visibility came at a price, and he was no longer willing to pay it. He had spent 30 years living two lives, the one audiences adored and the one he quietly protected. In the end, he chose the latter. Health issues continued to shape his daily existence. Multiple surgeries, mobility problems, and memory decline affected him in ways he never tried to disguise, but also never turned into spectacle. He did not grant emotional interviews about decline. He did not frame himself as a fallen star. He remained consistent to the end, private, measured, and resistant to exploitation. When James Garner passed away in 2014, the industry responded with warmth and respect. Tributes described him as decent, kind, professional, words that had followed him his entire career. But even in death, the deeper story remained mostly untouched. Few obituaries addressed the battles he fought off-screen. Few acknowledged the risks he took by challenging studio power. Fewer still examined the cost of being agreeable in an industry that demands submission. Garner's legacy is not defined by scandal or reinvention. It is defined by restraint. In a system built to own people, he fought quietly for autonomy. He did not win every battle. He paid with pain, lost opportunities, and long silences. But he retained something far more rare than awards or headlines: self-respect. The phrase double life often implies deception. In James Garner's case, it meant separation. He gave the audience what the work required, and he kept the rest of himself intact. That boundary is what allowed him to endure for decades without losing his identity entirely. Hollywood celebrates ambition, reinvention, and constant presence. James Garner represented something older and less marketable: consistency, limits, and choice. He did not disappear because he failed. He stepped back because he understood something most stars never do: success is not worth surrendering ownership of your own life. And that may be the most honest role he ever played.